for you guys?
With war, that's all you're saying. Nice.
Oh, I can't hear you properly now, Mark. Hang on a second. Mitch, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I've lost, I can hear music, but I can't hear Mark properly. Oh, it might be because the audio is playing. It probably is, actually.
Deakin University would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which our students and staff come together. As we learn, teach, innovate, and research through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the elders and ancestors who have cared for the country that you join us from. An ancient place where education, innovation, and knowledge transfer have taken place for many thousands of years. At Deakin, we aim to nurture and continue this important legacy whilst encouraging our communities to walk softly on country in the spirit of sustainability. In particular, we give gratitude to the elders and ancestors of Wadawurrung country, Wurundjeri country, and Eastern Maar country and beyond, where our physical campuses are located. Their contributions to our learning communities and environments are rich and highly valued. Deakin is committed to embedding Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in all disciplines that we teach, as well as advancing the self-determined interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including treaty and truth-telling. As you move around our physical and virtual environments, take a moment to consider, appreciate, and listen deeply to the country beneath your feet.
Okay, well,
Hello, Manea here,
Hey,
and welcome to the
Renee.
final day of the 2023 Student Voice Symposium, Partnership Opportunities Across Curriculum and Pedagogy. I would like to acknowledge the contribution and support of the Australian Council for Student Voice, ACSV, Australian Association for Research and Education, AARE, and the Centre of Research for Educational Impact, REDI, at Deakin University. The last two sessions looked at the history of student voice in Australia, student voice initiatives and issues, and what this looked like in schools from a student's perspective, as well as questioning the role of inclusivity and tokenism within the field. Today, we are fortunate to extend these discussions into research frameworks surrounding student voice. We hope that today's session, as well as the previous two sessions, help to motivate or inspire you as we move into the start of the new school year, whether at ACE, why do I say ACE? ECE, primary, secondary, or in various post-secondary or postgraduate pathways. Just to let you know that the chat function is enabled during this webinar, so feel free to say hello and connect with others. In addition, if you'd like to ask any questions directly to today's speaker, please use the Q&A function. With that in mind, let's start this webinar. Enjoy.
Well, good morning. Well, good morning or good evening, depending on where you're coming from. I'd like to welcome everyone to the final session of the 2023 Student Voice Symposium. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Associate Professor Marc Brasof, who's very generously agreed to be our presenter today. So welcome, Marc.
Hi, everybody.
Marc has taught for almost 20 years. He was a founding faculty member and history social studies teacher at Constitution High School, which is Pennsylvania's only history and civic themed public school. While earning his doctorate, he taught curriculum courses as a graduate student and then eventually at Arcadia University's School of Education in the doctoral educational leadership and teacher education programs. He's published scholarship examining secondary school improvement from the perspectives of student voice, distributed and democratic leadership, as well as civic and history education. He's authored the book Student Voice and School Governance, Distributing Leadership to Youth and Adults. And today we will be talking about his co-edited volume on student voice research methods. He's been awarded multiple awards for his work. He's certainly well known within the field and has publications in the American Educational Research Association, the Journal of Educational Administration, the Journal of Educational Change, the Journal of Educational Leadership, and the Social Studies Journal. So Marc, it truly is a privilege to have you here today, and thanks once again for joining us. And because everyone's here to listen to you, not to me, I'm going to now hand over to you so that we can learn more about this latest work of yours. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Angelique. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks, Mitchell, for setting things up. And Manea, it's so great to finally see your face and hear your voice. Just thank you for all the warm welcomes. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm hailing from Philadelphia, and it's like 6:30-ish right now, and my kids are getting ready for bed, and it might get crazy back here. So we might have like a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old come like running in here and trying to steal the show. And so, good morning, but also good evening as well. So also, I'm super excited to speak to Australian folks. In my understanding of the student voice world, Australia is like one of the leaders in this work. And the work that you all do is just really impressive and inspiring, and I share with my students all the time. And I see that Roger's here, and all the work that you do, Roger, to bring this information and knowledge to the world. It's met, it's understood, it's appreciated, and it's inspiring. So I'm just really super excited to be able to talk to you folks about this work. It's also nice to be able to talk to folks that just care about student voice. Oftentimes I'm in spaces where you have to defend or like advance why it's necessary. So it's just nice that I get to reduce that a little bit in this conversation tonight and to be able to have a great conversation with you all. I thought what I would do is open up with just some opening comments about the latest work that me and Joe Labayatan, he's out of McGill University, and then a whole bunch of contributing authors had put together in terms of the student voice research methods text that we put together. So I thought I would do a little bit of framing around that, and then I'd open it up to Dr. Howe to talk to me about, she has some questions, and of course all of you as well if you have questions. So hopefully it's a dialogue, and that's kind of what it is. So I figure when I can get my slideshow, let me share my screen. Let's do the Zoom world stuff. Slideshow. I've got pretty decent at this. So hopefully you're all seeing the student voice research framework. And so, yep, Hannah from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And lots of good things happening over in Philadelphia in terms of student voice world. And so happy if you want to talk about any of that, we certainly can do so as well. I was hoping to get to like why we did the framework, and then in terms of the field itself, and then I was going to sort of broaden it in terms of sort of our aims as a society. And then I was going to get into a couple pieces just sort of to open up at the dialogue around what principles informed the work that we did. And then dig a little bit into, I'll do one example of a question to show you how the framework can be powerful to folks. Ultimately, when we were thinking about in terms of the specifics of the field and student voice, we were obviously, and all of us, I feel probably might feel the same way, is that we want to see more student voice engagement in schools. And because there's just misunderstandings and misinterpretations what young people need and believe and think, and our understanding of schools and how our schools have to be adaptable and all that. And so the field itself is still trying to think through like how to do this research. However, what we uncovered in our work, working with authors and contributors for this most recent text in student voice research methods, is that the field is beginning to emerge. It's starting to mature. We've done a ton of qualitative research, and now we're starting to move towards this idea that we need to begin testing more hypotheses in a quantitative mixed methods way. And so we believe the field is moving out of its nascent space and moving more towards testable hypotheses that we argue that we have found through phenomenological study and qualitative research study. So much of like our work and research, as it makes sense for kind of folks that we are, the kind of questions we have, they typically end up being qualitative in nature, trying to understand the lived experience of folks. But we're now able to move beyond just that and do much more quantitative, longitudinal studies of the work that we're thinking about. So, which is exciting to think that the field is maturing in itself. Because of those conditions that are emerging, we thought as a set of researchers, Joe and I, when we put the text together and invited folks into it, that it doesn't seem to be a comprehensive text to try to synthesize lots of the theories and concepts and ways of thinking about how to do this kind of work in terms of research and practitioner work. And so we wanted to see if we could try at our best, in the most humble a way, try to synthesize what's going on in the field in terms of concepts and principles of doing student voice work, and see if we can offer a lens through a framework to do that work and do that thinking. So ultimately that was our aims of the text itself. And it just gave you a sense of like where we're at with this and how this is such an ongoing challenge for us. On the right, Kongswood High School. So I live in Kongswood, New Jersey. It's the state next to Pennsylvania. Just like 2 weeks ago, many of the BIPOC students in that school, in that high school, sort of walked out of the school for like 4 days straight, basically disrupted school for 4 days straight, because they felt that they've been making claim to the principal and administration that racism is real for them in schools, and they're feeling educators and they're not feeling the educators are taking them seriously or responding well. And because Kongswood is interesting in that we have several communities coming in New Jersey, there's lots of different municipalities and they're small. And so sometimes high schools serve multiple communities, not just one community. So we have multiple communities coming together into this high school. Sometimes for the first time, these kids are coming together because a lot of times, like, your relationships are established in like primary school, elementary school. I don't know what they call it in Australia, but like the K-8 experience, like students' relationships build, and then when they move into the high school, it's like people know each other. In Kongswood, like, kids are coming together for the first time ever meeting each other, and sometimes there's race differences in regards to that. So issues emerge. because anyway, so because those issues have emerged and administration hasn't sort of handled them very well, kids are like, we're kind of sick, and sick of this all, and they walked out for 4 days straight a couple weeks ago, and it totally disrupted school. And so administration said, well, we're going to hear you, but you have to come back to school. And so they put a forum together. Students said, these are the things that were going on. And administration was like, we're not sure if we believe you. And then they essentially threatened the kids to say, if you don't return back to school, then we're going to start suspending you and so forth. You're going to need permission and so forth. So they coerced these kids back into school, essentially. And so in the community meeting, they said all sorts of stuff about racial, some like sexual abuse, all sorts of stuff was going on. We're like, oh my gosh, like what is going on in the school? Like we're hearing all sorts of things there, right? And then we just got a letter today that that the students' concerns essentially aren't being taken very seriously. All right, the kids, like they're going to do investigations that it wasn't appropriate for students to do this, and that we need to sort of just move on from this. And then here's a protocol or a form that students can fill out if they have like future issues. So what this is teaching me is that in 2023, educators and administrators and community members are still struggling with the basic premise of listening to each other. Not understanding that the ways in which we are listening to them are actually disillusioning young people and also disenfranchising them. And then you think about, like, if you had a form that you had to complete about discrimination that was going on in your school, and you're a young person, the way that it was presented to the community was that the student had to print the form out, complete it, and then submit it. Or maybe they would print the document, make copies of it, and put it in the administrative office, and you have to come in. You think about it, like if administration or teachers are making it a hostile work environment, or like you don't have a printer or other things, like you're not going to get this information. And so they think that this is the most procedurally safe and fair way to get this information now. And viewing it from the students that are already complaining about the process, like this is not a process that's a process that's inviting us to give you feedback about what's going on in our community. So the protocol that's supposed to like be the reaction of addressing these issues has actually caused even more issues itself. And so what this continues to teach me is that adults are challenged when they're challenged to listen to young people. They're challenged to understand how young people might want to communicate completely different than what adults might do. Because, you know, for adults, like we want a protocol, we want to have a safe way of submitting our information or submitting our complaint, and we want to know that it gets to somebody, right? Young people are seeing this in the process to do that is, they're seeing it in a completely different way. And they're not also trusting the process as well. And so that in combination with being threatened to go back into school, my guess is by next week, there's going to be lawyers involved. And that the ACLU, which is our civil rights union, or the NCAAP, which is a group that protects the rights of Black and brown folks in this country, like they're going to get involved, and that the issue is going to get even worse because the administrators and educators are not thinking through how young people are understanding this issue of their experiences in schools. And so these are some of the same people that become researchers and become researchers and do this kind of work in the field. And so because these are adult behaviors and these are learned behaviors over time, Joe and I were like, we've got to think through this a little bit better and help unpack what it means to be reflective and to be critical, and how to think about the congruency between the context of our work and the way in which we do our work on a day-to-day basis, particularly when we're working with young people. And so more broadly speaking, our work is really trying to think about educating for democracy. And the way that I think about democracy in a relationship to education is that education is a dialogue, and that dialogue is ongoing, and it has to be inclusive, and it has to be done in a way in which power dynamics are reduced, and also in a way that engenders a greater understanding of the pluralistic nature of our democracy and the multiple viewpoints that we have as a society. And so in this way, democracy is democracy is a process and an outcome. Unfortunately, in schools in the United States, I don't know how it is in Australia, but in the United States, much of educational change that has occurred in the neoliberal reform movement has been much more about the outcomes of schools and less about the process of schooling. And so, like the standard-based curriculums, and I don't think there's necessarily there are inherent issues with having standards, but in generally speaking, standards are not such a terrible thing. But when you have policies that force schools to live up to a particular academic standards without thinking about the inputs into a school and the process in which that happens, and it corrupts the system. And that's what we've seen over the last 20 years in the United States, and people have been cheating and schools have been trying to game testing and gaming all sorts of systems to try to get the outcomes that the schools were expected to get, and reducing our understanding of the processes of schooling and education. I teach in a teacher education program, and the first things that my students talk about when they come into as a freshman are like the processes of our learning are totally screwed up, and also the outcomes that they expect us to achieve are making us feel crazy. They're creating anxiety on a day-to-day basis. They don't make it feel like we belong in the school. And so all of this system that we've built over the last 20 years, and I think it's been a corrupted system that we've built from corrupted processes, is undermining our education for democracy. And to me, this is a very, very important context in the student voice work that I engage in, hopefully the work that you engage in. And then the second piece, important framing for me in this work, is about the idea that research itself and the student voice work that we do has to be both impactful and sustainable. One thing that you're definitely finding in the field of student voice is that really, really great people, really well-intentioned people will come together and they'll say, let's do this really cool change process, this really cool project. And sometimes we're fighting just to get that to happen. But ultimately, the way that we design our projects are often not designed well within the context of the schools that we're working in. And so like a leadership activity becomes isolated rather than being integrated into the leadership activity of a school itself. I mean, at least in the United States, that's how student voice work often happens. And therefore, the student voice work that we do is impactful for the very small group of people that we're doing it with, but that impactfulness doesn't spread beyond its own, beyond the change agent itself. And so the impact really does become less, and then over time, it doesn't become as sustainable. And so that in relationship to policies and practices that are being decided in the school, there is a great distance or incongruency between what is happening and decided in schools and what students often need and want. And then that our student voice projects don't ultimately end up reshaping that paradigm because of the way we as student voice practitioners and researchers design our projects in the first place and the way that we think about it. So because of these issues that we think are true, or in other words, that's a concept of like loose couplings in schools in the in educational leadership world. Because of these things, Joe and I, and then a lot of the contributors that we worked with, again, maybe we need to rethink the way we do our research, or at least bring principles to the forefront to help us to unpack these issues in some way, shape, or form, to rethink about what kind of dialogues we're having and the ways in which we think we're going to impact our sites. So I'm going to briefly go over the framework because there's a lot to it. But I wanted to at least bring attention to the 4 principles and some questions for you all to think about. And we can talk more about this as we aim at this. So for student voice research to do well, or quite frankly, any research to go well, ultimately the aim here in terms of processes is to get to the intersubjectivity between the researcher and those that are being researched. Intersubjectivity is essentially like, do we get each other? Are we hearing each other, or do we understand each other? So mutual understanding. And so when we were putting together a thought like how to do research and what are the kinds of principles and questions we wanted to ask ourselves, the thing for us that was at the number 1 top of the list was intersubjectivity. And I'm like, do you understand each other? Are we hearing each other in ways that are meaningful? And are we sure we're interpreting each other properly? Oftentimes misinterpretation for good intention folks is something that happens a lot in all research, but all in schools. So intersubjectivity is like the center of dialogue in my mind. To get to that kind of level of understanding with each other, we believe that we need to attend to 3 other principles. That is reflexivity, power dynamics, and context. Reflexivity is well known in the research field because it's the idea that you not only have to be critically self-reflective of your own biases, but you have to do that reflection as you're doing your work. Because as researchers, as practitioners, we have power in schools, power in the educational spaces, and our very presence and the things that we do and say will have impact on the site and the work that we do. So it's questionable in some regards, and this is why qualitative research comes under fire a lot. But it's questionable if what we're finding is valid and reliable, because we ourselves are sort of influencing the field itself. And so in our own biases and how we think about the issues influence us, and how we think about our own childhoods and what we think good schooling is, or what's a great teacher, what isn't a great teacher. I mean, for years, I had a conception of what I think a great teacher is. And like, I have no poker face. I have a really bad poker face. My wife always tells me, like, Mark, you wear your emotions on your sleeve. It's so easy to read what you're thinking in your head. It makes me a terrible politician, but it makes me a fairly good teacher because students always know where I stand. But my colleagues are like, oh, well, I can tell Mark I don't like this idea right now. But so like, I'm my body, my language, my face, like I've been socialized in a Jewish culture. We're much more expressive. Like it's hard for me not to reveal what I'm thinking, right? So for me as a researcher to think that I'm going to walk into a space and that's not going to come up, I have to do a lot of work to make sure that's not being communicated. Because I want to make sure I understand truth, not my own experiences. I want to understand the truth of the place that I'm in. And so it is important to name, to list, and to unpack your understandings of youth, your own childhood, your own experiences, the kind of theoretical choices that you're making when you're going in the field. This is so incredibly important. And I find working with doctoral students, this is some of the hardest stuff to do. It's like, do you know that you have been socialized into a particular culture, in a particular way of thinking, and can you name it, and can you help to control for it in any way, shape, or form, so that you can at least explain it as part of your research process. That's reflexivity. And Joe and I have listed very particular questions for student voice research to help people work through some of those questions. The second piece of this is, or third piece of this is power dynamics. Power is everywhere. It's all the time. You're breathing it. To not name it, to not point towards it is being disrespectful to the notion that you have power. Youth, by the very nature of a category, or students or children, they're a non-dominant group. It's how, so we have to think through how we read, how we talk, what level of participation in the research project they need to be, or we want them to be. And that's something that's very unique and awesome about student voice research. It's the kind of work that Dr. Howe is working on right now, is like, in what ways should young people be part of that research process? This is probably not new for anybody in the room that's listening. So we want to try to unpack like what the role of a student is, where they are in the research process, how they have influence of the research process, and what the context says to us about the research process and where youth should play into it. So when there's context in terms of like the power dynamics, where like in that Collingswood High School that I'm talking about, I'm trying to enter into that space and like, do you want a student voice researcher and practitioner expert to help you with the student voice work? Like, do you want that, superintendent? And his response has been really, really telling to me, and they don't want my help. They don't want a student voice researcher because they don't want to hear it. It's clear from the way that the superintendent is responding to the students and the way that they're building protocols that it's tokenistic responses or performative responses to these young people. So to try to do a student voice project in that space in the hopes of eventually convincing the administration to maybe behave a little bit differently, it might be just a completely failed endeavor. And it might actually teach young people that institutions don't care about them even further, and to get them to be more disillusioned with democracy. And so would it be appropriate It would be appropriate to do the kind of student voice work that I would think is more radical and necessary for that school. I'm not so sure. It might not be the route that I want to do. There are major power dynamics that are going on. Maybe in the end, I make it worse for the students because then they become targeted by administration for their very ideas. And so you really do need to think about not only your own power, but the way in which students' power plays out in those spaces, because that will help you navigate what you want to do. Maybe you're like, screw it, I want to be a radical. I don't care. I want to go in there and do that. But then you need to help prepare those young people. If you're doing youth participatory action research work in that way, they're like, this might not work. Like this is real critical dialogues that we're about to have. So so that has to happen. We have to think about that. Students are not our experiments. And power, we need to work with them and think through like their situations as well, and the power dynamics of how we talk to them, how they talk to us, how they present themselves to us. I definitely have noticed that students are presenting themselves differently to me now in research work because I'm older and I have a different positionality and power over them. Like I research young people in my own program, but I do it through other people because I don't know if they will tell me fully the things that they like about the program that I'm running and things that I don't, even though we have a really great relationship. I'm not so sure because there's scholarships that are connected to it. And I can write a consent form and do all the work to say, like, listen, anything you say about this isn't going to affect your scholarship. But in the end, that's their scholarship and they don't want to make a mistake. So there are some real power dynamics that happen with us that we have to unpack and understand. And finally, and as the next activity I'm going to do with you all is going to show, is that contextual sensitivities matter. Absolutely. So youth, and this has been the big challenge for me as I get older, is trying to figure out youth culture and how that is not monolithic, and that like different youth have different ways of communicating. And that if we really want to get to intersubjectivity, we're going to have to try to figure out and adjust our methods to be more congruent with the youth that we're working with. And that's what one of the things that I really love about the book that we just wrote is that we put forward methodologies and strategies that are not typical for the research process that you typically learn in like doctoral programs. Like when we teach doctoral programs, we typically teach like interviews, focus groups, surveys, all this sort of the traditional methods. A lot of these methods, some of them may work with young people, some of them don't. So we've tapped into all these other interesting ways to think about working with students is to help to more or sort of like disabuse folks that those are the only ways in which you can do research with students. But so their language that they use, the technologies that they use, the way in which you build relationships and how to get that conversation going is the intersection between power dynamics and the context. Those sensitivities we have to think about and have to be absolutely in the forefront of our work. Otherwise, we may not understand or get the change that get the kind of data that we need to do the kind of change work that is necessary. And so I've, like in the last 2 years, I've learned that my direct form of communication as a strategy has not been effective for helping kids that are most traumatized by the pandemic and from their experiences before getting to college, getting to open up. Like I've had to do a whole different type of communication strategy to get students to even talk to me. I mean, email. I don't know if you all have been experiencing the email phenomenon, but like my students don't respond to email. Like they don't talk to me until they become like juniors or seniors in college. They're not using email. I don't know if I'm like really proud of them or like really happy with them because like I can't stand email anymore, but like they don't use email. They don't. They walk into my classroom and the first thing they do is open up their laptops. They don't communicate in the same ways when I grew up. I'm like, we didn't have laptops, we didn't have cell phones. So when it's not that we were like talking to each other more than those kids were doing, but we talked to each other in a different way. And we use different ways to communicate with each other. And so as each generation comes up to us, and as us researchers, we get further and further away from those generations, we have to rethink our context. We have to think about how the context and our strategies are congruent with each other. And I think what's powerful about the YPAR work and other strategies is that it forces us to rethink the ways in which we connect with young people and get into their networked intelligence. So just an example, I'm just curious, and I didn't sort of like do this properly with the animations, but I'm curious in the chat. It's just to sort of exhibit this framework and you all can answer. I'm gonna see if I can pull up the chat so I can see it. What and who is a student? Like, what is your definition of a student? And feel free to throw into the chat and see. Let's see what we come up with. Yeah. So, what is a student, or who is a student? Like, how would you define student? There you go. Heather's like, I don't use the term student in my research with children because it emphasizes the power imbalance between teachers and students. They are children or young people first. Beautiful. Anyone who's learning, but realistically for us, someone with an institution of a school, someone who is learning, and who's learning for almost anything. Yeah. It's interesting. Like, even as we're starting to get some definitions to roll in, we're starting to see a little bit of divergence in this. And I'm like with you on the Heather about young people, because I'm like, young people and student, sometimes they get confounded. Like they're called, like those definitions sort of seem like interchangeable, but they're not. But oftentimes I see it like, yeah, is it young person or is it? And when do you become not young anymore? Like, am I young? I can't tell anyone. I can't tell if I'm young anymore. I was just like, my students the other day, they were talking about some K-pop group, which is new to me. And there was like one of the K-pop groups, there was like some person in the group that ended up becoming 25 and they kicked him out because he was too old or something. And I was like, 25 is old? I'm 43, it must be ancient. Don't have to be young to be a student. Yeah. Probably defined as a learner in an institution. But like, then Jackie, which I don't disagree with you, just like as a challenge, like and I feel like I'm always learning as a educator. So am I a student? If I'm a learner in an institution, I'm definitely a learner, right? I go to professional development in my institution. I have to write up on my faculty end of year report the ways in which I'm learning. Students of life. There you go. Right on, Jackie. So it's confusing. It's not so simple. I mean, we often, like in the student voice world, we're like age, right? From like 6 to 23, which is the kind of the age range that we captured in the book. But like, there are people that are 96 that are students. I feel as 43-year-old, I'm still a student. I'm always learning. And sometimes I learn terribly. And then some of you were pulling out, which I love, is like, there's a binary nature to this idea of student, like educator and student. And that binary, if like we moved away from that binary, it begins to complicate the definition a little bit. And then sometimes, and we can think about like, well, who's young? And who's like, am I young? As youth is like, they're the, like, that's the one that we're in the student voice field that we're going to look at, young people. But like, I think UNESCO has like youth being like 0 to 23 or something like that. I think that UNESCO, that's their definition of youth. Some say that like a student is like just someone that we care for or to be cared for. And of course, then there's the idea of the monolithic versus non-monolithic, the more complicated voice. It's like any student doesn't really represent any other student. And so like this, all of a sudden, like it starts to like complicate things a bit when we start to think about this and who we think is a student, and might start to begin to build walls between student and educator, student and a researcher, young people and older people. We begin to make these distinctions, which we need to for in some sort of research class. We have to do participant selection, but it really, once you start to unpack the word, you realize that like it's loaded. It's definitely a loaded term, and so we need to be able. What we're arguing here is that we need to explore our roles, the identities and implications of working with students to understand our assumptions about students' youth attitudes, abilities, and meaning of their behaviors. Because in order to do that, we have to unpack who we think is a student and we don't who we think is a student. And just the very nature of being a student means you're learning from somebody else. And that whole dynamic also creates problems with our context, the way in which we set up our power dynamics, and the kind of reflections that we need to have in order to get young people to sort of talk through with us what they're seeing, what they're experiencing. So hopefully like that at least concretizes in some way some of the principles that we're talking about. And, I wanted to make this short so I can open up space for us to have a conversation around some of these principles and the ideas that were. Right. But anyway, the text, like that's the stuff in it, and here's a bitch. So Dr. Howard, Professor Howard, I'm sorry. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. I was madly writing notes as you were talking. I think you've raised some of the core issues that we all face in our research and in our work as teachers and educators. One thing I did want to go back to is you were talking early on about schools and other educational institutions don't tend to address issues faced by students, which then causes more issues because that communication isn't happening. Can we just go back to that?
Mm-hmm. So that let me see if I understand the question. It's so that the issues that we might be focused on, researchers, may not be the same issues that students see as important. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Just an example of that. I did a study in an AP history class, advanced placement courses. I don't know if they have this in Australia, but they're like college level courses that high school students take, and then they take a test. And if they pass the test, they don't have to take the class in college. So there's like this, it's sort of like a way to, reduce your credits in college and so forth. And it's like highly vetted space for parents in the United States, because the more AP classes you have on your transcript, the more college ready you look when you apply for college. Like, so basically you're a smarter kid. And so there have been some schools where like, the only way you can get into these classrooms is if you are recommended by a teacher. Other schools are like thinking through an equity framework, saying anybody can take the class, and some will actually pay to actually for the students to take the test. So I looked at like, what does it look like to have a mixed ability class of AP students? Like, how do you facilitate critical thinking in an AP class that's mixed abilities? And because I didn't consult with students before doing that project, I found out that the question is completely screwed up. Because like students are like, well, first of all, what is critical thinking, Mark? I don't even understand what that is, because I was asking questions about that. Secondly, they're like, critical thinking is not being facilitated in an AP class whatsoever, because AP courses are typically memorization and then taking tests. The other thing is like, all of our classes are mixed ability. And so even the question about mixed ability, it's like a bad assumption to think that an AP course is a mixed ability. You're almost assuming that mixed ability means like lower educational function, like, and the cognitive function. And this was in my early years when I was doing this. I'm like, yeah, you're right. And so the questions and the things that I was thinking about which the school was advocating as, like, I got that perspective because we used to work at that school, and I knew AP as like the gold standard. So I had all these assumptions about what was going on in this classroom. So I asked students, like, well, what should I study? They're like, well, why don't you talk about how critical thinking is facilitated in all our courses and help us to understand what you mean by critical thinking. And so my point being is that my biases informed what I was seeing, and some of the, also, let me pull back for a second, I was completely informed about AP being a critical thinking course in the first place. So me saying that AP was rote memorization was not something I understood at the beginning of that study. AP in the United States is considered like a gold standard. And a gold standard to me is that you're doing evaluative thinking, you're doing synthesis, and you're doing analysis, and you're doing creative projects. And so me coming into a classroom, into AP classroom, and assessing it, if it was doing critical thinking or not, was completely bonkers, because that's not what AP does at all. It's a memorization. But most folks think that AP is like the gold standard of critical thinking. And so that study was totally screwed up because I didn't place my questions in front of students first and think through what they would help, how they could help me rethink the problems that they were having in school in relationship to, is our school facilitating critical thinking?
And I think too that has so many implications for our work as researchers in even primary, secondary and early childhood schools. Methodologically going to the students first and asking what the issues are, rather than us coming in as researchers. Now, we're going to investigate this problem, which we may perceive as a problem, but students may not, or students may conceptualize that problem in different ways.
Yeah, and we have been trained to do that, exactly, right? We've been trained to like study the literature and study the field and be able to list and name every person that's thought about X, Y, and Z of our ideas. So how could the young people who haven't read anything about this be more knowledgeable than us about this particular topic? But what if like the field hasn't asked the right questions, or what if the context in which you're asking those questions are completely different than the literature that you've read? Like, we have to be very careful about those things.
And that links to what I was going to ask next, or not necessarily going to ask, but what I'd like to also delve into is that those contextual sensitivities do matter. So what is going to be an issue for students in one school may not necessarily be an issue for students in another school.
Yeah, for sure. And what scale, and this has been this problem in scaling up research, is that we haven't been able to take models that work in one school, like a reading model, right, and successfully implant them across the country, because the context change and the histories change, and how people, the social cultural conditions in every school is very different. And there was also similarities across places, but like a structure over here in this school that was successful won't necessarily be successful in this place over here because of all those contextual sensitivities that you're talking about, which is the complex nature of policy.
Mm-hmm. And also too, we've got to get away from that monolithic view of students as a single entity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And also too, I also wanted to delve a little bit more into, we all know, I don't need to tell anyone here, that schools focus far more on their outcomes, in all the different ways that we conceptualize outcomes, with a lot less attention paid to the processes that are enacted, to make those outcomes happen.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm with you on that. This is what keeps me up at night with my child, who was entered into public school, and she's 7, and she's got like sensory developmental issues, and she's like, I'm a drummer, and so the reason why I'm a drummer in a band is because I'm a kinesthetic. I love kinesthetic. I love moving. I like when I'm moving around and talking with people, like I learn, like my learning just goes through the roof, and it informs all the other things that I can do. My daughter is very similar. She she physically has to move a lot, and she shakes her body a lot. And if she just stays too, and she starts to get frustrated and overwhelmed when she's like sitting in a particular space for too long. And like And so getting the school to focus more on that than worrying about if she's reading at ABC level has been a real challenge. And because their resources and their curriculum have been developed to ensure that by third grade, they should get to this level of reading and writing, which puts teachers in this position of pressure where when you have large groups of people, it's hard to move classes in a way that you can really individualize curriculum and open up spaces for, because curriculum isn't designed that way in our school. To me, student voice research is the powerful force that can reshape this dynamic more so than I think other. Because we espouse the focus on young people, that student-centered learning, and that we're facilitating lifelong learning. That's what we're all about. But in the end, if kids are leaving school like miserable and not doing well and fighting teachers and pushing against them, then we're not doing something right. We're really not. And I think that what the pandemic has done has accelerated those forces in a way that people are like, this feels really wrong.
I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. Apologies to Roger. I've only just seen your question come through Q&A. Roger says, it may be that students have not clearly conceptualized what the problem is and what is needed. So how can we as researchers work with them to co-construct the focus and the purpose of the research, including why we are doing it and how the research might influence reality? And that comes back to that point you made earlier about our research must be impactful and it must be sustainable.
Yeah, and you know, I think a lot of this centers around relationships. You know, like I think our field has really messed this up a lot in terms of research. I don't think we're structured properly for this. So what I was told as someone who was in a tenure track position is that our job is to publish and get research out there and get enough and get known in my research. And I there was a point where I was starting to feel the pressure of, should I be collecting data right now? And should I be in schools, or should I be sitting in my office churning out papers? And can I do both? And the answer for me was, in a resource-strapped institution, is that I can't do both. I have to do one or the other. And except the research collecting, the data collection process is very, very time consuming. And the longer that takes, the less chances I get of getting myself tenure and promoted, right? And so the kind of stuff that Roger's asking, to me, I believe, is about slowing research, slowing that process down, and being in spaces and getting to know young people and getting them to not only to trust you, but you to get a sense of their space and get a sense of their space and their experiences, and to do that over time. And what I've noticed in the last couple of years is that when I've slowed myself down, I've been able to listen to young people better and do better research as a result of it. I don't do more research in terms, I don't pump out more papers, but I'm able to do better quality research because I've slowed down and been able to have taken my sort of wealth of knowledge and try to find ways to align it with what students are saying to me and the experiences I'm seeing, and help to point those things out. Like, I'm seeing this, are you seeing that? And to build a conversation where I would eventually build a research project out of my experiences with young people. That takes time, it takes effort.
Oh, yes. And it also goes back to your core point of the importance of intersubjectivity. Taking the time to get to know students before we work with them and to build those relationships then leads to high quality research.
Yeah. And what that means, like high quality research, you know what I mean? Like that's been the question of my career, is like, what does it mean to have high quality work? And did I do all my reliability and validity checks, or is my research impacting young people in a way that they feel like we're moving the system forward in some small little way? And what I've had to do is reduce ego and think, and like, this is like the fear of death. Like, you want to get as much out because you want to feel like you had an impact, and there's like grants, you know, you want to get known, all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, it feels like a hamster wheel a little bit. It doesn't feel like we're really helping young people out at all. You know, that feels ethically wrong.
I've just got another comment from Heather saying that her background is in dance and that she needs the same type of movement-based integration in her learning. And she said her research looks at children's perceptions of embodied experience of classroom-based learning, which goes back to what you were saying earlier about your daughter and yourself. And again, I guess that gets away from that monolithic view of all students are the same, that, you know, and you know, the whole idea of needing to get away from a one-size-fits-all approach is nothing new to anyone here, you know. But still, I think just to keep that, you know, intersubjectivity in the forefront of everything that we do, and to ensure that we get to know those kids, where they're coming from, what their contexts are. Harry's saying, I get kids to think about the problems that are bothering them in their lives, schools, and communities, and then ask them which ones feel like priorities, and B, if we knew more about them and understood them better, would that help us then do something about them? And that creates the motivation for a child-led research project.
Yeah, this is brilliant. Love it.
Another comment from Jackie. I like that, Harry, as the problem of research is not ours, but is born in the students' experiences. And yes, Jackie, absolutely. And Roger also said, agree, Harry. So the question at Collingswood is also to ask the student activists whether they want a researcher involved and why.
Isn't that the truth? Yep, that's the truth.
So, you know, I think, you know, it's getting away from that idea that we're just going to walk in. We've got a wonderful methodology. We've got a wonderful idea. What about the students? And Lou says, like all of us, young people absorb a lot of what Rescue calls dominant common sense, which does not necessarily speak to their needs for meaningful and socially just futures. At the same time, students emerge as sense makers from communities where rich funds of knowledge also accumulate around problems that they and community adults lives. So a key question, as I see it, is how, through interactive research with students as a curricular activity, to bring the rich funds of knowledge that they embody into curricular connections.
Well, for me, I mean, it's brilliant framing. For me, I think the contextual sensitivities is really plays here, because you'd have to completely change the context for that to happen, you know. And I think as a community, like, I'm curious about Australia and all the experiences you're all having, because I think to do what Lou is talking about, and I love it. I just think that it's really, really hard to pull that off in spaces in which don't welcome it. There was a school in Swarthmore. No, that was Dartmouth. There was a school where it was like some of the best student voice practices I've seen in the country. Their student voice, their government, student council government was like, it ran like a machine. They knew Robert's Rules of Orders. There was both students and faculty in the government, but students knew how to use the Robert's Rules to control dialogues that adults were sort of pressing into the space when it was being disruptive and not being supportive of young people and what they were trying to aim for. It was amazing to watch how government processes can push out bad power dynamics. It was amazing. I was like, why is this government so well functioning? And it was in the middle of the school day, and things were it was just unbelievable, the things that these kids were doing. And so I began to like asking like a more like, I knew that like if this was operating well, something about the school must be different than other schools. And it turns out that school was very much project-based learning, inquiry-based learning. There was like students can create different spaces for themselves to do different types of projects and after school activities, in-school activities. In essence, it wasn't that they had a youth government in their school or youth council that was effective. It was the entire school itself was centered more on young people. and how they were able to like build their curriculum with their young people. And it was a public school too. So it wasn't just like a private school that did this. And so for me, like for Lou's question, I think, and please push back if you don't think I'm answering this properly, I think the contextual sensitivities are critical here. And it will inform how successful or how we pull this kind of work off.
And Harry is saying too that, if students say why they want the adult support, it clarifies our role. That we're not just marching in there doing what we want to do. Sophie says, I also see that relationships and joint problem solving focus coming through in that restorative practice frameworks, which are being used in more schools to move away from a punishment focus.
Yeah, and I agree. I love that that's emerging. And to me, what that is doing is opening up space for dialogue and sharing. Like some of the things that I think schools have pushed out for so long is sort of the emotional aspect of the curriculum, which we're starting to see more as social emotional learning. But and generally speaking, that how young people are experiencing schools isn't really talked about in schools itself. We're not being meta in that space. And so what I really love about the restorative practice framework and process, it's opening up conversation about school in ways that I don't think we've done before. I did a study on youth court, which I don't know is fully a restorative model, but it was students talking with educators and administrators about particular cases of discipline and using a more of a restorative model to come to some sort of conclusion or some sort of arbitration or way to resolve the conflict, which was it was less about punishment, more about like restoring the relationships between folks. What I was uncovering in that process was that I watched over, I think it was like close to 20 cases across 3 different schools. And what I was finding was that a lot of the discipline referrals were inaccurate or incomplete with information, and that young people's conversations with each other and the administrators in the room were beginning to unpack all sorts of variables that were influencing the behavior in schools. And so I'm definitely with Sophia there. Like restorative is the way to go. Is like the more we open up dialogues in genuine ways, and we take those dialogues and we sort of spread what we understand to other spaces within the school, opens up the possibility of building a new ethos of what a school is supposed to do and how it's supposed to operate.
Another comment from Roger, and I'd also like to agree with Roger on this. He's saying a shout out to Eve Mays, who's been using very diverse ways to raise issues and processes with young people in inventing what research means. And he says this again points to the comments from Jade Frame in the first of these sessions about the underlying importance of student voice in lowercase rather than student voice using uppercase. So a research question becomes what facilitates or enables those relationships, that student voice.
Love it. Agree. It's beautiful. Smart people in here.
Oh, yes. Heather says methodology is based in Alison Clark's mosaic approach for listening to children. The challenge in this method is to adjust methods to suit very young children. So it seems incongruous that with older children and young people who are more competent communicators, there are still issues. Is the problem the socialization they experience in school? They have always had a voice. We just chose not to listen. What a brilliant point, Heather.
Mm-hmm.
That we just choose not to listen.
Yeah, and Kate Wall and her colleagues in our text talk about the way in which that is facilitated through space and time. And so, and how we have structured, unstructured space, and what is considered communication, which I think is fairly unpacked in that space as well in terms of the young children research. So yeah, absolutely. Those things are critical. I haven't facilitated research with young people that young. And so I still struggle to understand that. And my lens here is just being a father and seeing how my young children communicate to me and their frustrations. And, it is nonverbal, it's active, it's physical. It's done in so many different, and it's so interesting how they act differently in different contexts as well. And so I just commend anybody that's working with young people and what we can really understand about them, young children.
Lou has another good point to make here about the funds of knowledge approach, which has a strong track record in the US and elsewhere, and brings teachers and is increasingly bringing students into research in community spaces, engaging with community adults or funds of knowledge in students' life worlds that can connect with and enrich the better elements of knowledge that is built into the curriculum subject areas. And then Harry has responded to Lou, saying, I have found children able and willing to think more freely and openly about the reality of their lives than many adults. Sure, there are absorbing dominant common sense, but they haven't been buried in it like most adults. And then Lou has come back again and said, I totally agree. When I research in schools, young people teach me about their life worlds, and in the process, they act as knowledge makers, not just knowledge absorbers, towards addressing the problems that matter in their lives.
Yeah, and so this is where because I agree with all that. Where my thoughts have leaned towards like structures, right? Because how do we leverage those funds of knowledge in structural ways in schools, and how can us as researchers help us to rethink and rebuild schools with students so those funds of knowledge become part of the everyday life of a school rather than our research projects. And that's something I've thought very deeply about, even for like faculty and board of trustees. Like, how can we use the funds of knowledge of faculty to inform the kinds of decisions that boards of trustees or trustees make about our universities? And I have to say, when I was doing that work as faculty senate president at my institution, I came up against a lot of the same types of arguments that would be the reasons why we would exclude young people in K through 12 spaces. It was actually very interesting. And so my grounding in the student voice work became actually very essential when discussing with trustees, like, what does conflict of interest mean? And what does fiduciary responsibility actually really mean in an institution? Or should these be reasons why we wouldn't leverage the funds of knowledge of educators to help make decisions about their own institutions? Or are you going to continue to think that we're just going to fight for higher pay all the time? And that's the reason why to exclude us from board of trustee positions. We moved the trustees. Now they just voted 2 days ago. Now there's faculty trusteeships on our boards, because they're like, actually, for us to become a much more agile and responsive institution, we have to be vetting constantly what faculty are saying and thinking about their own institutions and how they understand the ecosystem of higher education. And so now imagine if we did that in K or high school and elementary and high schools, and like if we build structures that are actually permanent and real, that would take those ideas of funds of knowledge and really actually put them in spaces all the time. Isn't that the point of school in some ways?
Yes, very much so. Question for Mark from Roger. In your contacts, who is doing research about the conditions under which adults listen to students, and what facilitates that?
So who is doing research about the conditions under which adults listen to students? I'm not sure I understand the question. Well, it can be said another way, like who is understanding the conditions, and how do we understand that in relationship to how we then approach our work? Is that what that is asking?
Roger, may I ask if we could just have a little bit of clarification, just in case I'm not going to understand your question entirely either. Just while we give Roger a chance to respond to that, Manaya has said that she recalls a special edition coming up around listening to schools that's being looked at in the UK.
So in other words, like, how do we figure out the contexts in which we do our work?
Yeah, so who is doing that research about under which conditions do adults actually listen to students? I know that I'm not sure if this is an entirely relevant example, but I was on a research project where we went into 10 different schools, and we were looking at attendance. What do the teachers, parents, principals all think about, improving attendance. And in 8 of the 10 schools, we were only allowed to talk to the students in, say, in leadership roles, say in the student council or, you know, the student representatives. Only in 2 of those schools did they say, and they asked the students, of course, if they wanted to be involved, but only in 2 schools were we given any access to students who were disengaged and frequently absent. So, you know, what are the conditions, you know, that adults are actually willing to listen to students? And again, that comes back to the intersubjectivities and contexts in what kinds of relationships do different schools have with their students.
Yeah, and how useful, like, and I think you're alluding to it, how useful will this research end up being, or how much of our understanding of that problem will we really get at if you're not unable to have access to those young people that are disengaged most? And I think these are the things that we have to be, I think you're raising the issue because I think you know that you have to be careful about that. And then, you know, and then there's sort of like our pressures to perform as researchers. And so, I mean, I know my own institutional review board makes it so challenging to even talk to students. And so what we're hoping to do is to kind of counter those narratives with our IRB in the United States, to say institutional board, it's like we do have principles to help us to understand our own biases and how we affect the field and our own, like we're unpacking that stuff. We're thinking about that kind of stuff because when we work with young people, we want to get at what their understandings about it. And so there's just so many structures that are inhibiting our access to young people. And to me, that's why I think that one of the answers to this is to be in the spaces more and to just, before you're even doing any sort of official research, to get to know people more and build trusting relationships. And I just think that takes time. And I think that might change the dynamic, because once people will understand that you're amazing, Professor Al, then maybe they'll be more open to say, you know what, this is going to be a sore spot that we're going to be exposing to the world. Like maybe that's okay because we trust Professor Al, because we understand that we're just trying to figure this out, you know?
And Harry is saying, this reminds me of the discussion in session 1 about adults being less keen to listen to rebellious or transgressive voices, which is absolutely, you know, and like I said in my example there, that is absolutely the case, that most adults don't want to hear those voices that talk back. They want to hear the voices, I suppose, looking for compliance.
Yeah.
You know, looking at the kids who are already engaged.
Yeah, it's fascinating because my students in the education program, we're having very similar conversations about like, what does a productive classroom feel like? Is it more chaotic and loud and noisy, or is it in rows? Like I love that this is a conversation we're all having too. And we've read a little bit about what is a joyful classroom. What does it mean to have a joyful classroom? And just to unpack that as like first year education students, and one of the conclusions that we came to in that group was joyful classrooms are looking at problems and unpacking problems with each other and selecting and unpacking those problems together. They do want to engage in hard questions, but they don't have much agency to build those up. So in those spaces where I was working, where that was encouraged, that's when I, like Heather's saying, that's where I was happiest. And so, but that's why I go back earlier about this context, because I don't actually think many schools, public schools, for instance, I don't think they want that. And I think the public does want that, but they don't necessarily have the full language in our communities to advocate for that. And so what I've been saying is that students are just like disengaging completely, or they're walking out of their schools. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think we're in a really interesting.
Oh, sorry, we've heard back from Roger. Much research seems to focus on building student outcomes or even take a deficit approach to students in terms of voice. But if the key issue is the ethos or relationships, surely someone is researching how we develop the conditions within schools in which teachers, leaders, etc., as well as the structures, permit, encourage, allow those approaches, including under what conditions teachers and school leaders listen to students.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot more. My contribution to this, and I bet there's just lots of thought from this group. I have leaders, students talk about and read about sort of like the emotional space in schools and how schools are become too logical, and we've leaned way too much into sort of that now tendency of logic, at least the archetype of that. So there's like one, like we're just like not focusing in on like sort of like the heart of schools and emotions of schools because our curriculums don't allow for it. But what does that mean, Mark, in terms of spaces that have been designed and that are more hierarchical? And there's a scholar, Demareth, I think his name is, and talks about hierarchies. Hierarchies in schools hierarchy isn't necessarily a problem. Like rules and structures aren't necessarily a problem. It's when they become too rigid, is when they become problematic. And so how can you get schools to become more flexible and sort of like shift and change their structures? So there's another piece that we looked at in which we look at how do you get demoralized, highly rigid schools to sort of shift and change their attitude and mind. Like one argument is that you focus exclusively on young people and their experiences, and that changes the emotional strength of a school. Those that are demoralized, how do you like a demoralized school? How do you move them? Is like we're all there for young people, and that if we were given time and space in schools to really focus in on young people and hear their voices and work with them, and if we check our power dynamics along the way, and our administrators give us space to say to redesign and stop worrying about X, Y, and Z, just like think about and redesign and work, there's a chance that we could redo this thing and remove it. But the thing that I've noticed, I've had some doctoral students do a lot of work on professional learning, is that professional learning doesn't actually really happen much in schools. Or professional development sessions. That our schools in the United States aren't structured in a way where educators can actually spend significant amount of time talking to each other about their schools, and end up in isolation and silos. So what they're doing is repeating, because they're siloed, is like just repeating the behaviors how they're being treated. That's then being moved onto schools. So I think like one way that we could change this dynamic is to rethink teacher autonomy and the way in which teachers are treated. Because the more that we could give educators some autonomy and then help them with some structures and to facilitate ways that they can talk to their young people and ways that they can rebuild the curriculum, I think that's the approach that we could re-up on what we do in schools. And then to help those sort of interactions and rethinkings to rethink the routines of our schools and the way in which we structure our school. So it's more like a bottom-up approach, but top supported.
We're actually just gone slightly over time, but I just want to, there's a couple of last points that we can just use to finish off on. Roger says that the question is about who is researching the process of change within schools. And way back, I remember the work by Herb Fellon in Chicago about classroom ethos.
So like,
sorry, I cut you off.
No. So it's like name dropping, like which people should we read to understand these things. I always thought that Linda Darling-Hanning had a really great understanding of equity in schools, and she was the person I thought, Linda Darling-Hanning, that should have been the next Secretary of Education. I thought she was doing fabulous work to understand structures and equity, and then how schools policy had shifted from inputs to outputs. Right, we ended up focusing so much on outputs rather than inputs. This is when like opportunity gaps begin to emerge. Opportunity gap would be the would be the language that would be my inroad for this, because it looks at ways in which schools are, the conditions which schools have, the resources and the conditions that a school has that allows a young person to enter in and be successful. And that those are the conditions that we need to spend more time resourcing and thinking about, rather than worrying about just the outcomes of schools. So that's why I go back to like education as a process, the democracy about process and outcomes, and we focused way too much on just outcomes at this point. So anybody that's looking at that stuff is the way to go. And I always thought that Kelly Hanning had got that stuff right.
Just to finish off, Heather says, I'd be interested in talking to the teachers who apply their agency to listen to children and young people in environments where it is not explicitly encouraged. I expect those teachers have high levels of job satisfaction. Just conjecture from being a classroom teacher and a parent.
Yeah, well, I agree that a lot of that there is a high job satisfaction, but I've also seen, because I've worked with a lot of teachers in Philadelphia around this, they're usually very awesome. They have like an ethos. There's a value system there where they care. They want to be better teachers. They want to. They want their young people to understand citizenship and engage in on a daily basis. And then they end up getting incredibly frustrated when they start working with administration about the kind of feedback that the students are pulling together and bring into the space, into the administrative space. And they end up kind of getting disillusioned and either leaving or moving to another space that's more congruent with their philosophies and actions. And what we end up finding out is that they didn't really alter the school at all, and they ended up having to leave the kids. This is why I'm like, I think it's the harder problem for us in our field is to stop focusing on our individual interventions and way to be more collective about the bigger systemic issue that's going on here, that's undermining all of our work, right? And I believe it's the neoliberal school reform movement that has only accelerated and exacerbated some of these challenges.
And Roger notes too that, what we're talking about here interacts with Adam's points in the last session about the importance of teacher agency. And I guess, if we think about that ecological model, students need to be supported by teachers who need to be supported by the school leadership. Where do teachers get their agency to enact, the student voice that they want to, enact within their own classrooms? And then Heather just adds, I think there are long-term positive outcomes to listening to children. We've got well-being, mental health outcomes, employment outcomes, as opposed to incarceration for those students who are very much disengaged and not so much disengaged, it's not a word like disenfranchised with the system is probably is a better way of looking at it.
Yeah, I'm really super excited about this topic because because I was for a very long period of time very frustrated about trying to get students work to happen in schools. I was helping to build structures in different spaces, and then we would build them, and then it would disappear. I was so frustrated. Like, what is all this energy? And so I began to refocus on why is it that teachers and principals are completely unprepared for this. And so my move has been in the last 5 years is to think about, I'm like, well, where do I actually have agency? Like, where do I really have agency? And I can like reshape and do that. And it's teacher education program. I direct the teacher education program. And so then I started thinking, how much agency do the teachers that I'm raising right now, how much agency do they have in my program? Like, what are they, how are we shaping it? And so I've completely reshaped what I'm doing. And we're rebuilding our second education program and giving lots of leadership roles to young people in our program. I'm like, if I want my young people to eventually be change agents where they're doing this with young people in the K-12 space, then I have got to model that now in my teacher education program so they understand how to do it, the dispositions that they're going to need to build, and sort of the challenges and the opportunities of what that means. And like reshaping that where they're giving me real feedback and they're running the program with me right now, right? They're teaching me all these things that I didn't understand about teacher education, about their experiences that our program wasn't doing, and it was creating inequitable outcomes. Our retention rate for BIPOC students in teacher education, this is across the United States, but particularly at my university, was 79%, which means we were losing almost a third, or like, almost a third of our students, BIPOC students particularly, because of just all the things we were doing. Our retention rate after 2.5 years of changes is 96%. which is an enormous change. And it has a lot to do with just being with students, being open to the fact that my program, our program, isn't functioning well enough, and that we need to actually model the change processes that are very real for them, because it's going to help us. But now, I can't wait, but that's going to be the next level of research for me, is now that you've learned how to do this with me, let's now talk about how you're going to do that in your own schools now. And what does that look like for you? I'm really, this is what's keeping me in higher education at this point, because I wanted to be a principal. I was like, I don't feel like I'm doing anything anymore. And so this has changed my complete perspective about this. And I think that all of you, if you're like rethinking and you have the agency in your own spaces, ask that same question that we're asking each other right now in your own spaces.
We do need to wrap it up because we have gone over time, but I just want to just read out Lou Zippin's last comment. The ecological model also needs to engage interactively with people who live in the communities from which marginalised students come into schools. Involving community people's knowledge and agency is often missing from student voice models.
Yeah, totally right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
well, thank you so much, Associate Professor Brasof. You know, you've given us a lot to work with. I'm sure we could spend hours continuing these discussions. But, you know, your time and your efforts are greatly appreciated. And I really look forward to, I hope we all cross paths again. Harry said, fascinating discussion, plenty to think about. Thanks, Mark. And thanks, everyone. Good night from Ireland.
Oh, I'm going to be in Ireland in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Mark. That was so, it just brought out some really interesting discussion. And like I said, we could be talking about this for hours.
Yeah, this is a really thoughtful group, and I don't get to engage in the student voice research field in such interesting ways like this, because we're not organized well in the United States. And so just to hear some of this feedback and some of the pushing and the tensions, it's awesome. It's a great group.
Yeah, no, that I know a few of the people in this group, and I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. We've got a lot of really good people doing really good work in this space. And I think the more that we interact with each other and the more that we cross paths, the more we can have these kinds of discussions and sharing. You know, it just opens everything up to wider and wider discussions. And like you said, you know, we're not, the field is starting to mature. And this is where we need to have these discussions.
Yeah, and I agree. Love to be part of it more in any way I can. You know, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the opportunity. Learned a lot.
Very, very, very welcome. Thanks again for your time. It's greatly appreciated by everyone here.
Be well. Thank you.
Thank you.